Good morning and welcome. We have finally reached the conclusion of my week of Moonlit Seduction here on my channel. This is going to be the last look that I'm going to do like singularly with this palette, but you will definitely see it come back in my pet pairings in the very near future. So I hope that you enjoy this. Stick around to the end of the video if you want to hear my full roundup review and thoughts on this palette. I've shared already quite a bit throughout these videos, but today I'm just going to give you like the gist, the conclusion, my final thoughts on this palette. But for now, I'm just going to walk you through the look that we're going to do today, and then we're going to get started. So I've decided that I do want to kind of stick to the palette for our very last look, and I'm going to attempt to put the Rosewood Romantic shade through my crease very lightly, because I don't want it to be like too overpoweringly pink. I want it to just sort of act like a carving out neutral-ish type of shade that I can put through my crease and a little bit through my outer corners. And then I'm going to basically apply only the lilac, whatever it's called shade, lilac, Astral Lilac Aura shade. I just want to apply that with glitter glue all over my lid to see how that looks like on its own, because I'm quite intrigued. I haven't really tried that yet. And then in my inner corners I'm going to apply the gold shade, because I think it will fit very nicely with the rest of my clothing. Lower lash line, pretty simple, just this one, and that will pretty much be like a very simple sort of sparkly look. Okay. You are nice and zoomed in. Now I'm going to take my Zoeva crease brush here, and I'm going to go into like a very light dab of Rosewood Romantic and just try to apply this through the crease like in a very gentle layer and blend it out, because like I said, I kind of wanted to substitute statuesque, but without really dipping into statuesque today. I really wanted to dip into statuesque, but I thought, okay, well, let's keep it Moonlit Seduction only for the last look. Also because it's useful for you to see how versatile this matte can be if you wanted to use it instead of statuesque, because you don't have statuesque. I think this is applying so far quite nice and light, and the way to, you know, go about this, as you can see, is just go in with very gentle layers and blending out. Don't pack on a lot of pigment, because if you lay down a lot, you're going to have a hard time going back. Next I'm going to grab the Intensifies stick from Pat McGrath, just so that Astral shade has something nice and tacky to attach to and not cause a giant amount of fallout. And I'm just painting that onto my lid. And now, just using my finger, I'm going into that lilac Astral shade, and I'm going to apply it just all over my lid. That's a pretty shade. Oh, that is so pretty and ethereal. Definitely has a little bit of like sheerness to it, like in a certain light you can see that, you know, sheerness peeking through, but other than that it applies as like this most beautiful ethereal lilac purple, and I am quite fond of it, I'll be honest with you. For this next step I'm going to take a little packing brush like this one from Sonia G, and I'm going to go into the gold shade, the other Astral shade in the palette. And towards the inner portion of the lid, I'm actually going to also layer the tiniest bit of the gold over top of the lilac, so that we get a smoother transition, and also to show you that these two layered over top of each other are also very pretty. And finally, taking a small blending brush like this one, I'm going to go back into Rosewood Romantic and just apply a nice fluffy layer of that also on the lower lashes. Again, keeping it very subtle. Last time shining an artificial light, so enjoy them sparkles. I hope that you would agree that this last look is definitely ending this week on a high note, a very simple but very effective look. So this brings me to my final thoughts about this palette. So gather around the campfire, children, and let's talk about Mothership 10. So first and foremost, I am forever salty that these 4 shades here are not in her baked formula. And because of that, for me, that takes away something from the experience of owning a Mothership palette from Pat McGrath. It's just not the same experience. Which brings me to my second point. If you've never owned a Mothership palette, this is your very first time that you're looking into the Mothership palettes, there are 10 to choose from, you don't know where to start, and it's going to be your first time experiencing a Mothership palette from Pat McGrath, then my advice would be don't get Mothership 10. You're not going to get the full Pat McGrath experience. You're going to get sort of kind of the Pat McGrath experience, but you're still going to keep wondering what people are talking about when they talk about the fucking baked shades. So go and get yourself, I don't know, if you're into like the neutral side of this palette, then go get yourself a Divine Rose 1. If you want to get something that sort of has a similar vibe to this palette, I would advise you to go and get Mothership 1 Subliminal. So overall, I would say first time Pat McGrath customers, do not go for the Mothership 10 palette. Just as you don't go for Mothership 4 Decadence palette, they're not going to give you the full everyone's talking about Pat McGrath experience. With that said, none of the formulas in here are bad. They are all beautiful eyeshadows. They're all extremely high quality eyeshadows, including the 4, you know, special shades. They're still great quality. They're just not the baked formula, okay? Okay, now I'm going to shut up about the baked formula. Maybe one last thing I could add as sort of like a mitigating, like softening the blow kind of thing, is that I really like the 2 Astros that are in here. The 2 Astro shades are probably the closest that you're going to get to the baked formula, and I actually really like both of these shades. I really love how neutral this gold is, and I like how sparkly and wet looking on the lid it looks, and I absolutely love this lilac aura shade, lilac Astro Lilac aura shade, because it is such a beautiful, ethereal, fairy-like experience. It's definitely not something that we have seen from Pat before. My criticism on the tones of the 2 matte shades haven't changed. In my mind, the Moonlit Seduction palette already looks like this. To me, this is like a permanent, the shade Statuesque is a permanent resident of this palette, and to me this is what the Moonlit Seduction palette should have looked like. I don't mind the shade Rosewood Romantic, I love Extreme Nocturne, but I would take away that stupid plum and substitute it with Statuesque all day, every day. So to me, this is already how the palette looks like, and this is how I went about using it during this week. And I will probably continue to dip into mattes from other palettes in the future. To me, this is going to be 2 things. It's going to be a palette that I go into a lot for pairing looks, but also a real strength of this palette is that it resides in such like neutral, muted tones. So in a way, if you wanted to have like these very effective but still very neutral and toned down looks with the Pat McGrath signature sparkle on it, then honestly it doesn't really get much better than this palette. Probably the Divine Rose 1 would be my next recommendation, and then you really need to look at the tones, because Divine Rose 1 maybe still leans a little bit more cool toned compared to this one. This one really, this is a cool neutral palette, but in a slightly different like tone of cool compared to the Divine Rose 1 palette. The Divine Rose 1 palette has much more of those like mauvey, lilac, grayish cool tones to it, whereas here I feel like you get much more of those like classic neutral shades, like a classic pink champagne shade, a classic bronze champagne shade, this beautiful like charcoal taupe shade. If you wished to have a Pat McGrath palette that you can just go into every day to create your neutral office-friendly looks with a little bit of a twist, then this palette would probably suit your needs really well. There are still quite a few layering possibilities in this palette. There is still, you know, the option to create very beautiful and complex looks, but personally to me, this is not the most inspiring Pat McGrath eyeshadow palette that I have ever seen. To be honest with you, a couple of days ago I was looking at it and I was thinking, can I really create like 2 or 3 more looks for the week of Moonlit Seduction palette? Because I just fail to see all the possibilities that would create extremely different looks from each other. So that is something to keep in mind, that because the palette is so neutral and a lot of these tones are like quite light and quite like similar-ish to each other, like these 3 shades, they are extremely different shades for sure, but at the same time, once you put them on the lid, they're not going to give you tonally a lot of like huge differences between each other. So depending on what you're looking for in the palette, you may be more or less inspired by the Moonlit Seduction. Like, I find myself less inspired by this palette than by previous Mothership releases. Usually when I get a Mothership palette and I'm doing this week of, you know, palette, I always have the feeling that there were at least like 3 or 4 or 10 looks that I didn't really get to do. Whereas with this palette, I'm just fine closing off the week of Moonlit Seduction, because I feel like at this point I've like shown you most of the possibilities and what you can do with this palette. And between this and everyone else who has already done looks featuring the plum and the rosewood shade a lot, you've already seen it all. There is really not much more to it. So in a way, it's also a bit simpler, so a bit more approachable for people who don't know what to do with her other Mothership palettes. If I were to do a ranking of my Mothership palettes today, there is a very good chance that the Moonlit Seduction would end up on the absolute bottom of the list, because I love all of my other Mothership palettes more, just for the simple fact that they have the baked shades, but also because I feel more inspired by their color stories in a way. But again, Divine Rose 1 used to be my least favorite palette, but over the years I've really gotten to know Divine Rose 1, and during my pet pairing series especially, I have really grown to love some of the looks that I can get when I reach for this palette. So it has grown a lot on me, which is why I wouldn't do a ranking of my Pat McGrath eyeshadow palettes tomorrow. I would wait a couple of months, fully go into winter when I think this palette is going to be even more useful, and then do another ranking maybe in the beginning of next year or something, once I have gotten to know this palette a bit more and I can really honestly tell you where it ranks compared to the other palettes, and not just because of the lack of baked shades. I want to try to get out of the mindset that I judge this palette for the lack of baked shades. I want to look at it as a color story, as possibilities, as textures, and see how it compares to the rest of the collection. If you're a Pat McGrath collector and you are still undecided on whether you need this palette, I think something you also need to keep in mind is that a lot of the looks that you can achieve with this palette are relatively closely dupable with other palettes that you might have from Pat McGrath. Like each of the looks that I've done this week, I feel like we could take similar-ish shades from her other palettes and you could achieve similar-ish type of looks. Are they going to be 100% the same? Thank goodness no, because that's not what we want. We don't want like 100% repetition here, but the general like vibe of the looks is going to be very similar. Personally, I do not regret having purchased the Moonlit Seduction palette, because, you know, I just absolutely adore Pat McGrath and her vision, and I can still see the benefit of this palette, the gorgeous like neutral glam palette that you can use on the everyday, you can take along with you traveling and rely on for doing simpler but effective and glam looks. On the other hand, as someone who has experienced the rest of her collection, this palette is a bit of a letdown for me, but not enough of a letdown for me to say, okay, in a couple of months I'm going to declutter this palette. Last year when she had the two quads, the Deep Space Divinity and the other one that I forgot the name of, I used the two quads once and I already knew these are going out of my collection. I do not at all feel like this for Moonlit Seduction. I want to keep Moonlit Seduction, and in fact I'm going to a congress in a couple of months, and I was actually thinking of taking this palette with me because I like the idea of being able to do those like effective but glam looks, with the downside of course that I still need to drag Statuesque with me. Now at this point I feel like I'm starting to loop and repeat myself, so I don't think that there is much more to say about this palette at this point. So I'm curious what your final thoughts are based on what we've done throughout this week, based on all the thoughts that you have heard so far from me. What is your feeling about the Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction? If you haven't purchased it yet, do you lean towards yes? And if you have purchased it, how happy are you with it? Do you feel inspired by it? Just very curious to hear your thoughts. As usual, thank you so much for watching. We shall see each other again for our regular scheduled programming next week for a Pat McGrath pairing. I've also been editing already for like a whole week the makeup that I took with me traveling, and I absolutely need to sit down and do my like summer roundup and empties video, because I've really been slacking with that part. Anyway, I'm going to head out to work now. Thanks so much for watching and see you soon. Bye!